This is a Faith Defenders audio presentation.
You take your textbooks, please, and you would turn to page 12. We now have advanced in our analysis of the diagram, which gives us a structural approach to studying the different systems which compete with Christianity, to the point where we are now dealing with the individual concepts which comprise a system. As we pointed out on level 1, you deal with the person who started the system and the person who holds to it. Then you deal with the nature of the faith that they have, for faith is the basis of all systems. And then we dealt with the presuppositions, the assumptions, those things which are assumed to be true, which have yet to be proven. And now we finally come to the individual concepts or ideas which make up the elements or bulk of the system itself. Hopefully, most of these ideas and concepts are consistently developed out of the assumptions or the presuppositions that are to be found at the lower level. And there are several questions which we should ask, particularly of non-Christian systems at this point. As we think of the different concepts that are functioning in secular humanism, in the Unitarian Universalist faith, and other religions in our own day and time, do we see any concepts in these non-Christian systems which obviously have been borrowed from Christianity? That is, they will have foreign elements in their system. Whereas they begin, let's say, with the assumption of evolution, that man is an animal, and that man is not distinct from many of the other primates or animals that roam about on this planet, yet they will turn around and have a concept which deals with the dignity, the worth, and the significance of human beings as opposed to animals. Let us take, for example, the non-Christian who assumes basic non-Christian thought, particularly human autonomy and ontological thinking, these basic assumptions of non-Christian teaching, and yet this non-Christian was very, very involved in the civil rights movement in the 60s. You meet this non-Christian, and they tell you that they believe in the dignity and in the oneness of humanity. They object to herding black people with cattle prods into boxcars. They feel very strongly that the Negro should be viewed as one with the white man, and that all the races should be viewed as making up one humanity, that there is only one race, and it's the human race, and there is dignity, and there is worth. They talk on and on about the peril and about the horror of slavery. And yet, when you begin to question them in terms of their basic assumptions, you find out that this person assumes the theory of evolution. And he assumes that man is an animal who has fought his way to the top by the survival of the fittest. He rejects the biblical idea of Adam and Eve, of there being only one parent for all of humanity, but instead teaches that each of the races develop from different kinds of primates. So the Negroes develop from one certain kind of monkey. The Caucasian or Caucasoids develop from another kind of primate, and the Mongoloid from another kind of primate. In terms of racial distinctions, anthropologists basically divide humanity into the three: Caucasoid, Negroid, and Mongoloid. And it is often viewed that each of them have different ancestral origins. They evolved from different animals. Well, you see, having assumed the theory of evolution and having denied the biblical teaching of the creation in Adam and Eve, how in the world can this person consistently have the concept of the oneness of humanity when he views the races of having developed from different primates? How can he speak of humanity having dignity and worth when man has no dignity and worth any greater than that of any other animal, such as a dog, a cat, or a skunk, or a rat? As a matter of fact, why can't one man make another man a slave? Why is it wrong to use a cattle prod on people and to enslave people financially, economically, socially, culturally, politically, as well as physically? Well, you see, this person is inconsistent. Now, this illustration happened to develop within my own context. I have a brother-in-law who assumes the theory of evolution. He is very hostile to Christianity. He is into Silva mind control. Now, that is an occult group that believes that by the power of thought, you can will things into existence, so that you can wish hard enough for money, and somehow or the other, you'll get it. So when he would drive into New York, he would say, "I am willing a parking place." Now, in New York City, you could drive around for 4 hours looking for a parking space. So you had better do something. And I always pray. And when my brother-in-law told me that he was going to will himself a parking space, I bound him in the name of Jesus that he wouldn't find one. And around the block he went. And around he went. Well, you see, in talking with him concerning the gospel, I remembered that during the 60s, he was involved with the civil rights movement. So I couldn't help but say, "Now, Warren, your system robs some concepts from Christianity while you don't want Christianity. It is Christianity which holds to the unity of the human race. Everyone came from Adam and Eve, and everyone came from Noah and his wife and his sons and daughters-in-law. It is Christianity which believes in the dignity, significance, and worth of every human being, because we are created in the image of God, and we are more than an animal. We are not a machine, we're not an animal. And civil rights is a Christian insistence. The abolition movement was done by Christians such as Sir William Wilberforce, a famous evangelical Christian in England who set the slaves free. How can you consistently hold to evolution and civil rights at the same time? Well, after a few minutes of discussion, he couldn't help but say, "You got me there." He had no answer. Dr. Ralph Neighbor, who has a very large church down in Houston, Texas, who wrote the book, The 7 Last Words of the Church, we never tried it that way before, gave me a ring and said that he wanted to thank me for the book that we're using as the textbook, because he had to get a hold of a copy, and he read it while he was on flight to another city to do a preaching engagement. When he disembarked, he found himself talking with one of the pro-nuclear groups that had a little card table there set up in the airport. And it ended up, the guy was an atheist. But at the same time, the guy began to condemn all sorts of things as being immoral and being wrong. And Dr. Neighbor said, I was able to sit down with him and to show him that with his presuppositions of atheism and evolution and all the rest, how in the world could he hold to such Christian concepts as the unity and dignity of the human race? And he said, I just wanted to tell you that that is the first time I ever met an atheist that within 5 minutes I had him in a corner instead of him having me in a corner. And you see, when you deal with non-Christians, you must realize they have to borrow from us if they're going to live in our world. We must never forget, if someone wants to say, we are all vegetables in a garden, they may say that, but they must breathe God's air, and they must eat God's food and live in God's world according to God's law, or they'll be dead as a dead vegetable in this world. They may say there is no such thing as a law of gravity, but when they leap off the building, they will find out that the laws do not conform to what they want things to be. So you will find that the non-Christian systems which abound on every hand, they borrow from Christianity while rejecting Christianity. I'll never forget in the 60s, I was down in Greenwich Village, and there was a Black Panther man standing on the corner handing out some racist paper or the other. And I started talking with him, and I got him to say that racial discrimination was wrong. Once he committed himself to that, I worked him back to the point where he had to admit that it is only because of the Bible, it's saying you shall not kill, you shall not steal, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, etc., that teaching could have ever evolved in this world of slavery. And it was amazing to have him come to the point where he said, I want the concepts of Christianity, but I don't want Christianity. Well, what you must do is remind these people they cannot have their cake and eat it too. Yes, there are concepts which are often borrowed from Christian systems, and these concepts are utterly inconsistent with the presuppositions which form the basis of most non-Christian teaching today. So the first question is this: are there concepts in this system which are borrowed from the Christian system? They're borrowed capital. It is only the borrowed capital that gives any system an appearance of truth and consistency. To the degree they borrow from Christianity is to the degree that that system will have success in this world. Did you know that communism is a Christian heresy? Communism is based on the Christian eschatology that there needs to be a new man in a new society in which everyone will treat each other according to the golden rule. They have simply taken God and Christ and the kingdom out of it, and instead said that communism will produce the new man who will be selfless and loving and kind. There will be a classless society, which the Christians call the millennium, and all they did was take Christian prophecy, secularize it, and put it out. To the degree a system takes from the Christianity, to that degree it will have an appearance of truth. The second question that you need to ask is this: as you're dealing with the system, are these concepts consistent with each other? Do they relate to each other? It's not only is this concept consistent with the presuppositions, but do these concepts correlate one to the other? And the answer is no. One good illustration is Sartre, the famous existentialist. He said, since there is no infinite point of reference by which we can interpret all particulars, because there's no God, therefore there is no meaning for any particular person or thing in life. So nothing has meaning, nothing has worth, nothing has significance. Then he turned around and signed the Algerian Manifesto, which said that the war between France and Algeria was a dirty war and should be stopped. It was a wrong war. It was wrong, and France was wrong. Now, if you say out of one side of your mouth, there are no absolutes, no morals, no standards, no meanings, can you turn around and out of the other side of your mouth say that this or that war is wrong? You cannot say that. In Europe, once Sartre signed the Algerian Manifesto, the people on the left bank in Paris felt that Sartre had betrayed the whole existential movement. He had completely abandoned the very principles which he had so eloquently put forth in his novels and plays. Or again, I'll never forget that Jewish woman in the park who screamed that there could not be a God because of Hitler and his dirty work. When I pointed out to her that if there is no God, Buchenwald, Auschwitz, and Dachau were perfectly all right, that there would be no standard by which to judge Hitler, she realized that she could not, as one concept, say there is no God, and with another concept say that Hitler was wrong in killing 6 million Jews. The concepts are not consistent with each other. The same thing with the scientist who says in the classroom, you are no different from the desk you're sitting in. The desk is one quantitative arrangement of molecules. You are another arrangement of the same kind of molecules. You do not have a soul. You do not have a spirit any more than the desk has. You are no different than from the desk. But if you take that same man and kidnap his 3-year-old daughter, who's the darling of his life, and leave him a note saying, I took her, you have a desk, so the exchange is equal. That man would be very quick to tell you that that daughter is worth a lot more than that desk. For you see, the two concepts will not work out. The worth of someone cannot be paralleled to the idea that nothing has worth. The third question is this: are these concepts coherent? Are they understandable as a whole and in their parts? The test of coherence has only been challenged in this century by the existentialists who attempt to attack any views of systematized meaning. But the problem is this: they are very coherent in their attack and arguments that coherence is not a test of truth. So when someone says to me, well, I don't believe in the coherence test of truth, I simply respond, well, explain to me why. Well, and then they give me their reasons. And I said, you know, you are very coherent in your arguments that coherence is not a test. You have just proven everything you seek to refute. When you're dealing with any system, if it is a system, there will be coherence in whole and in the parts. Now, I believe one of the most consistent non-Christian thinkers that ever existed was a man by the name of Critulus. He was a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher. That is, he lived in the very bloom of the golden age of Greece before Socrates and Plato. That's the very beginning of written history so far as the Western world is concerned. And Critulus finally came to the position, because he believed in panta rei, all is fluxed, all is relative, everything is changing so quickly that nothing has any definite meaning, that he realized for him to say that would be to refute himself. For someone to come up to you and say, words have no meaning, well, they expect those words to have meaning and for you to understand what they're saying. But nevertheless, they hop up to you all with enthusiasm and say, words have no meaning. So he decided he was going to be consistent. He never spoke another word as long as he lived. When you went up to him and said, Critulus, what do you say? All he would do is wave his little finger, trying to give you the idea that all is moving, all is motion, all is flux. But you see, even that was not consistent. He shouldn't have been allowed to do that. If you're going to say there is no meaning, then you can't say anything. In particular, you can't say there's no meaning. Now, this is the absurdity of humanistic thinking. They will come up to you and say, no certain knowledge is possible. And you must respond, are you certain about that? Or they come up to you and say, you cannot know anything about God. And you must respond, well, you must know an awful lot about him to say that. And you see, they keep destroying themselves. And here Critulus was consistent because he realized coherence, if it is true, means you can speak. If coherence is not true, then you may not even speak to deny it. So all he did was wiggle his little finger, and that is not a coherent system. This is why the Dada school of art did not live so long. Dada poetry was done by taking magazines and cutting it up and throwing the cut letters and words up into the air and then picking up pieces, and the poetry was made out beep ba di this gong ka pin ta pong. Well, that didn't go over too well. Then they did art with da-da, using chants and throwing dice and all. They desperately wanted to get away from the test of coherence. But the problem is this. They appeared at a certain time and place within the history of art, and it is perfectly understandable and coherent why they were doing what they were doing. Even in their madness, they were part of the overall coherence of the history of humanity. Now, this is a grand test, coherence, whether or not a system is understandable in the whole and in the parts. Or again, are these concepts cohesive? That is, do they hang together? Now, you can think of a train, and you can think of the hooks that go from boxcar to boxcar, or from coach to coach. Does this system have these links so that the ideas follow one to the other and connected? So it's a train of ideas. You have a train of thought. Or is this system simply a pea-picker's paradise? Some person who inconsistently goes and picks up an idea here and picks up an idea there. Here an idea, there an idea here and there, much like McDonald's old farm. And you see, one of the tests of a system of whether or not it is a true one is the test of cohesiveness. Are they just simply unconnected ideas thrown together in a random manner? Much like a box of pearls. If you have them unstrung, sitting in a box, just a pile of them, you can discern no meaning in it. You take them out and you string them so they are connected one to the other, and then you have a bracelet, or you have a necklace, or you have something that has meaning. Or again, are these concepts self-refuting? Do they carry within themselves the seeds of their own destruction? Now, it's rather obvious that your more superficial people, the people who say, everything is relative, there are no absolutes, they were just absolutely sure about giving you that absolute. Now, they can be a little bit deeper, like Sigmund Freud and others, who said, all your concepts are not to be viewed as absolutely true because they have been conditioned by the culture, by the environment. So that what you believe is the result of psychological conditioning brought to you by your home, your church, and your school. The only problem is you turn that around on Freud himself and say, Freud, what you believe is something that has been psychologically conditioned. He'll say, no, I'm telling you what's really there. If you're right, then you're wrong. If you're right, then what you believe isn't true either. You have destroyed yourself. Or again, take the famous Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. In the history of Western philosophy, we now must date basically everything in terms of pre-Hegel and post-Hegel, because the coming of Hegel has really brought a dividing line in the history of philosophy. Before Hegel, beginning with Aristotle, it was understood by all philosophers that there was a basic law. This basic law was called the Law of Contradiction or the Law of Antithesis. Now, in symbolic logic, the Law of Contradiction or Antithesis is written in the following way. The wavy line means not or no. It's a negative. The brackets refer to simply the universe that now exists. Inside is your syllogism or your statement. In the universe that now exists, it is not possible for alpha to exist and at the same time for alpha not to exist. Something cannot exist and non-exist at the same time. If something is here, then it is not there. If something is true, then it cannot be false. If it is false, it cannot be true. So if a statement is true, it cannot be false. If it is false, it cannot be true. If you are here, you cannot be there. And this law of antithesis, this law of right and wrong, formed the basis of the history of philosophy up to the time of Hegel. But when Hegel came along, he said, now we've got to get around this. We've got to get around the law of contradiction. And I'm going to do it. I say there is a thesis, something you state positively. This naturally causes an antithesis to arise, which is the opposite of the thesis. But then these two things naturally give way to a synthesis which combines both the thesis and the antithesis at the same time. So that instead of something either being right and wrong, something can be both at the same time. Now his famous illustration was simply this. Let's begin with non-being. Now if non-being is your thesis, what's the antithesis or antithesis? Being. Now according to Aristotle, something cannot be non-being and being at the same time. But Hegel said, aha, I have thought of a way out of that. What is non-being and being at the same time? Becoming. Something that is becoming is in the process of leaving non-being and going into being, but it is neither non-being or being, but in between. So he said, therefore, I have destroyed the law of contradiction. Now then he went on to develop his idea of the dialectical process. You will hear those terms, they're even in Newsweek. What did he mean by dialectical process? Well, if you begin with non-being, and then you go over to being, which is the antithesis, then you get the synthesis. It doesn't stop there. There is an antithesis to this synthesis, which actually is another thesis. And that gives way to another synthesis, but then that also will have an antithesis, which will have a synthesis, which again is actually a thesis, which will go on to another antithesis, to another synthesis, and so you have a dialectical process in which progress is made, in which you are going up and up and up. Because of what Hegel taught, Darwin developed the idea of evolution in biology. Without Hegel's dialectic process, there would be no theory of evolution. In the world of economics, Karl Marx took Hegel's position and said that you begin with the savage, and then you begin with the feudal systems, and then you get to capitalism, and then capitalism gives way to communism. Communism or Marxism has a dialectical process in which different classes fight with each other till at last you arrive at utopia. With evolution, at last you arrive at the supreme being of humanity. And you can apply it to other fields such as history. Hegel, a man like Wildenbahn, took Hegel and applied it to history and rewrote history to correspond to thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Now what Hegel went on to say was this: truth is never found at any point while the dialectic is in process. Now that's sort of obvious, isn't it? Because the moment something is stated, the opposite is coming right around the corner. So truth is never found in the process, but only at the end will truth pop up. Now this is the question of self-refuting. If Hegel is right, is he part of the dialectic process? Yes. He's part of history too. If he's right, then his philosophy is not true either. So if he's right, he's only one of these that it came a long time to the next person to refute what he said and to go on. So if he's right, he's wrong. And if he's wrong, he's wrong. Either way, he's wrong. And you see, with astute philosophers like Hegel, he did not realize that he was actually destroying himself. He carried within his own system the seeds of his own destruction. Or again, can these concepts stand up to a rigorous exposure to the law of contradiction? The law of contradiction is important to the Christian because it is a law based on God's being. Now, why do I say that? Well, Titus chapter 1 and Hebrews 6 says, in the universe that exists, it is not possible for God to be God and God to lie. It is not possible for God to lie. Now that means the law of contradiction is rooted in God's being. If someone says to you, can God do everything and anything? Say no. He cannot do anything which contradicts his nature. He cannot do anything which would diminish his glory. God can only do those things which are in conformity to his own nature. So Paul said, God cannot lie. Well, that's the law of contradiction. God cannot be God and at the same time be a God that lies. For this reason, Christians believe in the law of antithesis. We believe that if something is true, it is not false. If something is right, then you cannot say it's wrong. There is a difference. If something is right, it's right, and it will always be right, regardless of the situation. The humanists all believe in situation ethics, which is the calliope of ethics. Something is right today and wrong tomorrow, and right the next day. But Christians believe, no, there is antithesis. There is right, there is wrong. There is truth, and there is falsehood. And you see, what Hegel did was refute himself again. How? What Hegel said was this: within the universe that now exists, it is not possible that the law of contradiction is true. What he simply did was use the law of contradiction to state an attack on the law of contradiction, and because he had to use it, he proved it. You cannot deny something unless you accept the law of contradiction. So when Hegel said the law of contradiction is wrong, he was saying that it couldn't therefore be right. He betrayed his own dialectic when he said that the law of contradiction was wrong. So he refuted himself in two ways. With this dialectical process, if he's right, then he's wrong, and we can't accept what he said because he's part of the process. And by using the law of contradiction to try to refute the law of contradiction, he established the law of contradiction. You cannot negate something without using it. It is a law of linguistics and of human language that you cannot speak in a subject-object manner without the law of contradiction. Or again, can those who hold to these concepts believe what they live and live what they believe? Now, this is very important. This is one of the reasons that Christianity appealed to me, and it appeals to me more and more every year that I live, particularly as I attempt to be more and more consistent in my Christianity, which is simply this: can you live what you believe? Can you believe what you live? Now, Sartre could not live what he believed. He believed that everything was meaningless, but he signed the Algerian Manifesto. John Cage believes that everything is based on chance, but then he goes picks mushrooms, which is a hobby based on order, not on chance. The scientist in his classroom who said there's no difference between you and the desk runs home to his little girl and picks her up and wouldn't give her away for 1,000,000 desks. You see, people are inconsistent because their systems are inconsistent. But you see, now I'm a Christian, and I'm a biblically defined Christian, and I find I can live what I believe. And I believe what I live. My Christianity says You'll never be perfect. You'll sin every day. You'll never have complete perfection in this life. You will have persecution. You will have trials. You will have temptations. Some mornings you will get up and feel like a toad. You will not feel like a Christian. You will be mean sometimes. You will nag your wife, yell at your children. You'll get greedy for money. My Bible talks about life in the most realistic way. Abraham lied. Jacob schemed. David committed adultery. Peter was a coward. And you go right on down the line and you find the Bible paints the portraits of the saints with all their warts and moles. No biblical character is ever presented as being perfect or sinless except Jesus. You want to talk about Paul? Talk about the big fight with Barnabas. An old bull-headed Paul wouldn't take Timothy. You want to talk about Joseph? Will you discuss his using the occultic tool of the tea leaf readers in his cup of divination? And you find that the biblical authors and the saints did not hide their defects. A Christian can live his religion because it's a sinner's religion. A Christian can live what he believes and believes what he lives. Whatever happens in life corresponds to what the Word of God teaches us. Are these concepts verifiable? Do they correspond with what is there? Can we investigate the claims of these concepts? Someone tells you man is a machine. There are various psychological tests which show that man is not a machine. They've tried men versus computer, and a man can win because he has intuition. He has ways of choice that are not logically computed by way of computer. Art is another example that demonstrates that man is not an animal and man is not a machine. But when you come to Christianity, there is nothing I have ever found in terms of empirical evidence that would show that Christianity is not true. I've had to deal with many theories against Christianity, but I have never had anyone show me empirical reality which contradicts Christianity. They may show me some bone of a gibbon or a gorilla or a chimpanzee and tell me that's the bone of a caveman. But then I find there's some other equally qualified scientists who say that it's nothing but a bone of a gibbon or a gorilla or a chimpanzee. And therefore they can't deduce something that is still under question. But I do not find that my Christianity is threatened by the archaeologist Spade. I have nothing to fear but fear itself. Lastly, after we examine the individual concepts of a system and ask the questions that we've just asked, we come to the grand conclusion, which is this: the logical conclusion of a system. A system is going to take us someplace, logically, if we're consistent. Where it will take us is the question. With the Christian system, you end up with meaning, significance, hope, love, God, salvation, forgiveness, peace of mind. You end up with everything that forms the aspirations of man since the time his feet ever were on this planet. But with your non-Christian systems, there begins a destructive process that ends up in a total negation of everything that man has ever aspired to be or to know or to do above that which is purely animalistic. In the Christian world and life view, there is God. And of course, there are the angels, good and bad. And then there is man. Man related to God because he's in the image of God, but man also related to the animals because he has a body like they do. So man has a circulatory system and animals have a circulatory system. That does not mean that man is an animal, but it means that man in his physical side is related to the animal. But in his spiritual side, he is related to God. And then there are the plants. And then there are the things, the inanimate objects, the stones that make up this world. And the Christian says, hey, there is God, and thus there is meaning, there is hope, there is salvation. There are angels, there is man, there are animals, there are plants, and there are things. But along comes the humanist and says, well, I refuse to believe in God. Well, that's good, but once you begin that, there's a downward process that happens. Once there is no God, is there any reason to talk about angels? No, so let's get rid of angels. But once you have gotten rid of God and angels, the only reason you had man separated from animals was that he was related to God. And since you no longer have that, thus if you say God is dead, man is dead. God is dead, angels are dead, man is dead. Man, as he was understood by the Christian world, is dead. Man is no longer to be viewed as having worth and having significance. He is merely an animal. Now do you understand why the scientists are talking about breeding people like they breed cows? They believe, some of them, that everyone should pass an IQ test. And if your IQ is not high enough, you will be sterilized. If you have a high IQ, male or female, your eggs or your semen will be collected at regular intervals, frozen for the future, and those women who will be picked to be carriers will carry your children to have the best genetic strains, to make those pure type of individuals, thoroughbred human beings. This is why they can talk about raising a baby in the womb of a cow. This is why they can talk about aborting babies or killing old people, euthanasia. What do you do with a horse when it breaks its leg? You shoot it. What do you do with the little old grandmother? You shoot her. If you don't want any more chickens, you go out and crush the eggs, fertilized or not. You don't want any more people? Go kill the babies. Once you have reduced man to animal, you no longer have any dignity for man. But on what grounds were animals separated from plants? Well, again, the Christians noticed that in the Bible, you had to be polite to animals. Proverbs says, the righteous are kind to animals, but the wicked are cruel. But you don't read anything in the Bible about being kind to an ear of corn. You get out your molars and go to work. You can be quite cruel to that carrot stick. Well, now the humanist says we should no longer talk in terms of animals or plants, but at last we have arrived in which everything is spoken of simply in terms of inanimate objects, things. You're a thing and I'm a thing. Either you help the state to get its production levels up, or you will be liquidated and turned into fertilizer. 1984 by George Orwell is a very frightening book. I am afraid while he's off schedule, he is envisioning something that's the horror of the future if Jesus Christ does not return. I cannot help but think that there will be bigger Dachau's, Buchenwald, and Auschwitzes in the future, where people will be turned into soap, fertilizer, their hair will be used for making of cloth, the men who had tattoos will be skinned to make lampshades, pocketbooks, and shoes. Teeth and bones will be used for artifacts, where you will have people in the little white coats who will say, why do we let all these bodies go to waste? When someone dies, they should be taken to the recycling station, made into compost, made into soup, made into those green chips of Soylent Green, that most horrible movie which gives a drastic view of the future. Once I saw that movie twice, and each time in horror. I said, oh God, may Jesus Christ return before we reach that time in history where man turns upon man and cannibalism becomes the rule of the good society in the name of recycling material. May God help us